In the early days of this radio program, in the late 1990s, I communicated often with Russian spy Colonel Stanislav Lunev. And if you don't recognize his name, Colonel Lunev is the highest-ranking Russian military spy to defect to the West. He was deeply involved in the Soviet operation to hide nuclear suitcase bombs in the USA and other parts of the world, including Europe. One day in early 1999, I was talking to Colonel Lunev while waiting at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport for a guest to arrive, and he and I were outside the airport terminal. Colonel Lunev was leaning against a pole, puffing on a cigarette as usual. He was a chain smoker. And all of this, this New World Order stuff that I talk about on the radio was all very new to me at that time. And I just innocently blurted out a question to the former Soviet spy. And I said, Colonel, is it true Russia has developed red mercury bombs? Well, he almost choked on his cigarette, and he took the cig out of his mouth, and he got up about 3 inches from my face, and he said, men have died asking that question. You have no reason to know such things. Well, my next question was, what do you think of the Yankees this year? I switched gears really fast. I was like, let's talk baseball. It's like, I'm smart enough to know when to get out of this mess. I got the message. There are topics that can get a person killed very quickly. Move on to the next topic. Well, Colonel Lunev, however, did speak quite openly with me on other occasions about super secret weapons. He told me about Russia's plans to launch a satellite that would unfold into a giant mirror in space. The mirror would direct sunlight to urban centers on the Earth, thus blinding the eyes of millions of people. We also discussed whether psychotronic generators exist. He said he had heard rumors that the KGB used a psychotronic generator on President Boris Yeltsin to induce a heart attack in the Russian president while he was in the Kremlin. I quickly discovered that at that time that talking about the existence of such weapons will earn you the ridicule of most people you tell. It's a sure way to start somebody's eyes rolling around in disbelief that you're talking about such things. But in March 2012, a high-level Russian defense official, Anatoly Serjokov, said, quote, the development of weaponry based on new physics principles, direct energy weapons, geophysical weapons, wave energy weapons, genetic weapons, psychotronic weapons, is part of the state arms procurement program for 2011 to 2020. That's a quote. That was in Russian news media last year. One other weapon that Colonel Lunev discussed was a Russian secret weapon to cause earthquakes. Once again, he said he had heard rumors, again, this is 1999, he had heard rumors that the Russians had successfully used the earthquake generator. Well, recently, London's Telegraph newspaper reported that the United States and New Zealand conducted secret tests of a tsunami bomb designed to destroy coastal cities by using underwater blasts to trigger massive tidal waves. The tests were carried out in waters around New Caledonia and Auckland during World War II and showed that the weapon was feasible, and a series of 10 large offshore blasts could potentially create a 33-foot tsunami capable of inundating a city. The Telegraph said the plans came to light during research by New Zealand author and filmmaker Ray Waru, who examined military files buried in the National Archives. Mr. Waru has been involved in New Zealand's radio and TV industries for over 30 years. He recently published the book Secrets and Treasures, Our Story Told Through the Objects at Archives, New Zealand. Ray Waru is on the phone right now in New Zealand. Ray, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks very much.
Well, I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this topic because, as you can hear in the introduction, I've heard about such weapons for a number of years, and usually, as I said, people roll their eyes and just say that that kind of stuff doesn't exist. But how did you stumble upon this information about a World War II tsunami bomb?
Well, I was looking through the files of Archives New Zealand for a number of things. And I actually did just stumble upon a whole stack of reports that had been completed in the 1950s, some years after the actual project, which was called Project SEAL, this secret experiment to produce a tidal wave bomb. I came across it purely by chance, and there they were all sitting there. They were being vetted to be released. However, if the Russians, as you say, are considering something themselves, perhaps we should lock them back up again.
Well,
but it was surprising because New Zealand has had, as you probably know, anti-nuclear legislation since 1987. We don't allow nuclear armed or powered ships to visit our ports. And the very thought that little old New Zealand was developing its own weapon of mass destruction during the Second World War was really quite a surprise.
Ray, who originated this tsunami bomb idea?
Well, the idea really came from an American naval officer whose name was Gibson. He was involved in constructing military bases around the Pacific after the U.S. entered the war. And he observed that blasting operations to remove coral reefs around Pacific islands sometimes produced an unexpectedly large wave. And he thought this had offensive kind of weaponized potential. So he communicated this idea to the Chief of General Staff, the New Zealand Chief of General Staff, a man named Puttick. And he was interested, and he took the idea to the New Zealand War Cabinet. They also thought it was a good idea, and they set up some preliminary experiments, as you've already mentioned, in New Caledonia off the coast of Noumea in 1944. There were American and British personnel there, and a group of New Zealand observers led by a local scientist named Leach, who would ultimately conduct the experiments in New Zealand.
Any estimate of how many of these tsunami bombs were produced?
Well, actually, no bombs were actually produced. After the Noumea experiments, the U.S. Pacific Commander, the redoubtable Admiral Bull Halsey, was enthusiastic about the possibility of making bombs. So he then wrote to the New Zealand War Cabinet to set up the secret project in New Zealand. It ran for about 8 months from June in 1944 until January in 1945. And over that period, they had thousands, almost 4,000 explosions to test whether or not they could, make this thing work. Some of them were just little charges, but some of the charges they used were hundreds and hundreds of kilograms. One of the interesting things that I discovered in the report was that they began the research under a mistaken assumption. There had been some early British research on deep-sea charges, and they had thought that to make a gas bubble large enough to produce a tidal wave, you actually had to put the bomb quite deep in the water. The Operation SEAL test suggested that that was wrong, that in fact to make a big wave, the charges had to be placed quite close to the surface. The other thing that they found that you've already mentioned was that a single big bang wouldn't do it, that you had to have an array or a line of charges. And they suggested, their experiment suggested that you might have needed as much as 2,000 tons of TNT or some kind of explosive that they said could produce a 30-foot wave if the explosions were made simultaneously about 8 kilometers from the shore. So they got down to some pretty careful calculations, I think.
Ray, any indication in these archives that that this weapon was used anywhere?
No, the weapon was definitely not used anywhere. In fact, there's some debate about how successful the whole experiment was. When you read the report is very positive about the potential for this thing as a genuine alternative to the atomic bomb. And in fact, during the early years of the Cold War, the experiments were taken up again. They weren't conducted physically, but a group of postgraduate engineering students at Auckland University tabulated all the Project SEAL information and produced a report, which was the report that I read, that was called the Generation of Wave Systems, that was published in the 1950s. However, in 1999, a man who was involved with the actual experiments, a chap named Tony Lang, who was 87 at the time, said the whole thing was a bit of a fibber. He said that they tried lots of experiments, but if you were in a rowing boat, you probably would have survived the shock. So whether or not it actually would have worked, I think is open to some debate, really.
Mm-hmm. But we're talking about technology and experiments conducted 70 years ago.
Well, that's right. Also, of course, the people that were conducting the SEAL experiments wouldn't have been aware of the Manhattan Project. The New Zealand government must have been aware of the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, because we sent 11 scientists to New Mexico, so we must have been involved with that. But of course, the Trinity test wasn't until, I think, July of 1945, so the Project SEAL was actually closed down before anybody really knew about the atomic bomb. So you can imagine if these scientists had been experimenting with the opportunity of using nuclear explosions in their array, they might have had a different idea about how easy it would have been to produce a tidal wave.
Ray, what was your initial reaction when you first realized what you were looking at?
Well, I mean, I think my initial reaction, having seen the news of the gigantic tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004 and the huge tsunami along the coast of Japan in 2011, you'd have to think, what a ludicrous idea. But of course, this was something that was developed during a period of war. And since the Japanese home islands were obviously susceptible to the effects of tsunami, and clearly the Allies were planning, even at that stage, the invasion of the home islands of Japan, the idea of using a tsunami-type bomb to prepare the way for an invasion clearly was something that was on people's minds. It's not clear at all in the report what the target of a tsunami weapon may have been, but clearly the preparation of the Japanese islands for an invasion would have been something that people were thinking about.
But up until you saw these formerly top-secret documents, had it ever occurred to you that governments were considering how to flood cities and kill millions of people with ocean waves?
Well, not me personally, but then, who can know what goes through the minds of governments? And I would have thought at a time of war, anything is possible. And then even the people that created the atomic bomb, some of them, of course, changed their minds after they knew what the destructive potential of nuclear weapons might have been. And I think, most wise people in the world today would agree that the world needs not one single nuclear weapon at all.
Are you acquainted?
I agree with those.
Are you acquainted with the Russian politician Vladimir Zhirinovsky? Zhirinovsky.
I think I know his name, but I'm not ready.
No, okay, yeah. He's a quite colorful character in Russia, and has a sizable following. I think he's run for president a few times, and he's a force to be reckoned with. And after shortly after the March 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, it was about a month later, Mr. Zaranovsky was on a national Russian television news program, and he definitely had been in the vodka bottle. I mean, it was very obvious, that his necktie was loose, and he looked a little disheveled, but he was quite talkative that day. And
they say during the war, loose lips.
Yes. Yes. Well, the question is, we don't know whether Mr. Zaranovsky was just drunk and just making stuff up, or whether he was, he had loose lips that day. But he made a reference to the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, and he said, essentially, he said, hey, if Japan wants another dose of what we gave them, we'd be glad to do it. And he said, we have weapons that can put entire continents to sleep in minutes. And, and I thought it was a very chilling comment that this guy made, because what had happened was that the week, just days before the tsunami that hit Japan, the governor of Tokyo said, Russia and China are our enemies, and before the end of 2011, we will have nuclear weapons. And before the week was out, the nuclear power plants at Fukushima were underwater, and the one plutonium plant which would be necessary for them, was substantially damaged. So anyhow, I'm just throwing this out, Ray, because I think these weapons are in existence. I think they're being used, and I don't think we've seen anything yet of what demented, sick, demon-possessed people in possession of doomsday weapons can do to us. Now, the other topic, I'd like to find out this, because while you were digging in these New Zealand files, not only did you come across the Tsunami Doomsday weapon, but you came across some documents about UFO sightings in New Zealand. What did you find there?
Yeah. Well, surprisingly, New Zealand seems to be on a very popular flight path for UFOs. The government released all its UFO files a couple of years ago, and there are thousands and thousands of reports of UFOs. I mean, the U.S. Project Blue Book and all that sort of, and some of the English files have also been made public. And there, likewise, are thousands and thousands of sightings. A lot of the sightings, of course, are just missed sightings or people getting overexcited about seeing something that is clearly a natural phenomena. But, like them all, there'd be a small handful of sightings by professional eyes, like pilots and policemen and things, that still, remain unexplained.
I understand that some of these files go as far back as 1909.
Well, there were the files themselves really only go back to the beginning of the kind of UFO phenomenon, really. In the sort of the early years of the Cold War. We remember that the first UFO was really only sighted and named, as it were, in 1947. But throughout history, there have been lots and lots of sightings, and there was a famous international sighting. New Zealand wasn't the only country involved with this, but in 1909, there was this thing called the Great Airship Flap. And a number of strange sights were seen in the sky all around the world, and there seemed to have been a tremendous amount of similarity with some of the sights. Nowadays, of course, with the Internet, if somebody spots something somewhere on the other side of the world, it could be repeated within seconds.
What did these airships look like? Do you know? Do you recall what anything said in these reports?
Well, they were described as long, cigar-shaped objects that had different kinds of lighting patterns around them. They were described as airships because at the time that was the only kind of mental picture that an individual, living at the beginning of the 20th century would have had in their mind. Nowadays, of course, if somebody saw something similar, they would call it a UFO. But it was called an airship. They were long, they were slow-moving, they were seen by many people, they were often seen by groups of people, and they were in fact seen all around the world.
And what about? I'm not acquainted with Francis. Is it Chichester?
Francis Chichester, yes.
Yes. What was that story about?
Well, he had a UFO experience when he was flying in this part of the world. He became famous later on in his life, of course, as being the first man to circumnavigate the world in a small yacht by himself. But previous to that, he'd had this UFO experience in our part of the world. So you'd have to put him in the category of somebody who, and he was a pilot flying at the time, of somebody who wouldn't be prone to seeing something that wasn't there. I mean, he saw something that was unexplained, he was followed, and he thought it was a UFO.
And this is a gentleman, this is a hero in your country's history. He was the first solo.
He was English.
He was English, but he flew the first solo flight between New Zealand and Australia in 1931.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yes, so he'd been in this part of the world, and his yacht, the Gypsy Moth, is actually at Greenwich, in part of the Greenwich Maritime Museum in Britain. Mm-hmm. So his was an interesting experience. The other interesting experience that people had in New Zealand was a sighting that occurred in 1979. I don't know whether you've heard of it. It was called the Kaikoura Lights. And over the Christmas period in 1979, two separate freight flights between our capital city, Wellington, and a southern city, Christchurch, saw a number of unexplained lights. On the second flight, an Australian-based news crew filmed them. And even today, it's considered one of the best documented UFO sightings anywhere in the world, because there was the film, there were pilots, there were journalists, and the objects that the people in the plane saw were being tracked by radar at both Christchurch and Wellington airports at the time. So there's a whole combination of sightings and recordings of what are still completely unexplained phenomena.
Okay, what about the sightings of extraterrestrials wearing unusual masks? Yes, wearing masks. What was this about? Well,
I mean, I would have to say that I'm not sure how far I would take those. There are a number of records of people who have had face-to-face experiences. I think you would now call them close encounters of the third kind.
What did they say they were wearing?
Well, there was one gentleman who basically recorded the entire wardrobe of an alien, and he was wearing gigantic shoes. I'm not sure why, but he was wearing gigantic shoes. I have to say that was, when I looked at those particular reports, they didn't seem to have quite the same credibility as some of the other reports.
All right, including the Pharaoh mask? There was I remember reading something about somebody had described the aliens wearing Pharaoh mask.
Well, yeah, there were, and in fact, the masked beings tend to be relatively common in terms of sightings, I'd have to say. Mm-hmm. But even today, there are still sightings, and there's a YouTube video that was actually made a couple of years ago by a chap in New Zealand who was filming a modern aeroplane. And behind the model aeroplane is a clearly unidentified bright silver object. All right. So even today, UFOs are being filmed, and they're up there on YouTube.
All right, Ray. One last question before I let you go. I know you also you saw some old documents about the 18th century navigator James Cook, and this beautiful story about the ships being guided between the islands. You know which story I'm talking about with the dolphins?
They were. I mean, the ships were guided both by dolphins, and of course they had navigators. They picked up a Tahitian chap who helped them navigate between islands. The document they're talking about is a letter that Captain Cook wrote before he left on his last voyage, and it's the oldest object in Archives New Zealand. It's also one of the saddest because when Captain Cook wrote it, he didn't know that he would never come back because he was killed in Hawaii before he could finish the voyage.
Mm-hmm. It's just it caught my eye. That he wrote about being that his ships were being guided between the islands by a dolphin. Well, listen, the book is Secrets and Treasures, Our Stories Told Through the Objects at Archives New Zealand, and the author is filmmaker Ray Waru. Ray, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking time to giving us this insight into what you discovered in your research. Appreciate having you on True News.
It's been a great pleasure.
In the early days of this radio program, in the late 1990s, I communicated often with Russian spy Colonel Stanislav Lunev. And if you don't recognize his name, Colonel Lunev is the highest-ranking Russian military spy to defect to the West. He was deeply involved in the Soviet operation to hide nuclear suitcase bombs in the USA and other parts of the world, including Europe. One day in early 1999, I was talking to Colonel Lunev while waiting at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport for a guest to arrive, and he and I were outside the airport terminal. Colonel Lunev was leaning against a pole, puffing on a cigarette as usual. He was a chain smoker. And all of this, this New World Order stuff that I talk about on the radio was all very new to me at that time. And I just innocently blurted out a question to the former Soviet spy. And I said, Colonel, is it true Russia has developed red mercury bombs? Well, he almost choked on his cigarette, and he took the cig out of his mouth, and he got up about 3 inches from my face, and he said, men have died asking that question. You have no reason to know such things. Well, my next question was, what do you think of the Yankees this year? I switched gears really fast. I was like, let's talk baseball. It's like, I'm smart enough to know when to get out of this mess. I got the message. There are topics that can get a person killed very quickly. Move on to the next topic. Well, Colonel Lunev, however, did speak quite openly with me on other occasions about super secret weapons. He told me about Russia's plans to launch a satellite that would unfold into a giant mirror in space. The mirror would direct sunlight to urban centers on the Earth, thus blinding the eyes of millions of people. We also discussed whether psychotronic generators exist. He said he had heard rumors that the KGB used a psychotronic generator on President Boris Yeltsin to induce a heart attack in the Russian president while he was in the Kremlin. I quickly discovered that at that time that talking about the existence of such weapons will earn you the ridicule of most people you tell. It's a sure way to start somebody's eyes rolling around in disbelief that you're talking about such things. But in March 2012, a high-level Russian defense official, Anatoly Serjokov, said, quote, the development of weaponry based on new physics principles, direct energy weapons, geophysical weapons, wave energy weapons, genetic weapons, psychotronic weapons, is part